Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see the numbers participating, albeit I can't see you. So on that note, please do use the Q&A function. Alice and I would love to be able to answer your questions that you really have and any challenges that you are facing, be that in your initial discussions or if you're in the process, any challenges that you feel that we can support you with. So do please ask your questions. So this is perhaps maybe the fifth such webinar that we've held, so whether that's myself and Alice or Simon Bevan as well. Today what we want to focus on is not the actual ins and outs of the consultation itself and the steps. We want to focus on what we have seen, what our observations are, and the areas that we think could be the possible pitfalls that we want to share with you and how to possibly overcome some of those pitfalls. But if you do want to look at the actual day-to-day process of going through a consultation with your staff, do have a look at our previous recordings. You can all be found on OnStream. If you're having any trouble finding them, drop us a line. We can always share the links with you because we do have a catalogue there that you can call upon. So if we have a look at the agenda, so what we want to cover today, it's always good, I think, just to have a look at some statistics. So I'm going to be having a look at that with you and some of the approaches that you can take. Schools do often ask us, well, what can we do? What are you seeing schools do more frequently now? And we want to share some of that with you. We can't have one of these sessions without looking at trade unions. They're becoming more and more vocal and are really filling the space. And rightly so, they are there to support their members, but we need to understand, how are they tackling this subject? What sort of pitfalls might you see? What sort of dialogue are they having with their members, and what should you be aware of? So we want to cover some of that with you today. Then I'm going to hand over to Alice, who will take us through the actual planning, the project planning, the communication, the consultation, and what that might look like. And throughout each of those steps, Alice will look at, as I mentioned before, the pitfalls. And then we're going to finish with a short poll, because we do want to hear from you, and then we'll move to a Q&A session. So if we move on to our statistics and have a look at some of the recent stats that we can share with you. So I've had a look at Freedom of Information Act requests that have been made of the Department of Education. So I wanted to share some of those, and I've sort of listed the key ones that we've seen, so you can see the change over a period of time. So 2019, when we first started talking about the increase in the contribution rates, the number of schools that had withdrawn at that time, so it might have been completely unrelated to TPS at that time, but 62 at that point. And you can see the numbers have then started to increase. How it's presented will vary, because it really does depend upon the question that's being asked of the department as to how they answer it. So January 21, that's an interesting stat there, 181 schools had left. And as of September 19, and that July 2021 request, the response there being 260 schools had left since the 1st of September 29. So that's a huge and significant number as a consequence of the changing contribution rate. So what are schools doing? I've had a look at some statistics on the next slide, which focuses on APTIS, because that's one that was put in place for the sector. And the slide will set out the changes there that we have seen. How many schools have joined APTIS over time, starting back in January 2020, and the most recent that I had there is for May 21. So you can see that the number of schools participating in that scheme has steadily increased. And speaking with APTIS, as we do on a regular basis, whilst they might have 186 schools there as of May, that number would have increased a lot since. But it's the number of schools with whom they're speaking as well that continues to increase, and it's probably a comparable amount to those that are in the scheme. Now, APTIS isn't the only one that operates in the sector. Royal London is another one that very much operates in the sector, as does the Pensions Trust. So they're all ones that, if you are thinking about who you might want to speak with, they're perhaps three of the most significant ones that we are seeing participating in this arena. So moving on. So our next slide, just to share with you some of the approaches now. So the next few slides, it's just looking at what could you possibly do and what are schools doing. So the ones that I've set out for you here, again, it's just in a few bullet points. But if you do want the more detailed version of this, if you have a look at OnStream, the first webinar in this particular series did focus greatly on the different types of approaches that schools are taking and the ins and outs of each. So continue with TPS, an obvious one. So that does help with the recruitment and retention, and it has its gold-plated standard, as the sector will come to describe it. But yes, there is that future cost uncertainty. So what might you look at by way of alternative if you didn't want that uncertainty? What might McLeod bring to the conversation? So that was the particular case that was brought to look at whether or not ring fencing final salary scheme to those who are within 10 years of retirement, whether that was age discriminatory or not. So that's one particular way in which you can continue. So that's with the TPS. You can withdraw from the TPS, withdraw entirely, give notice to the TPS after having consulted with your staff, and move to a DC scheme, so a defined contribution scheme. What might that entail? What might it look like? Financial advisors will talk you through the types of schemes that are there that you can offer and what the additional benefits around that particular scheme could be, and what the possible contribution rates might be that employer and or employee contributions, and whether or not salary sacrifice could also be used as part of the scheme. We're seeing a number of schools operate in this particular way, looking at possibly 16.48 being the old contribution rate as the minimum employer contribution, but many a school has its own contribution rate, and it may well be up to the 20 or even the 23.68. We're seeing some schools look to contribute on behalf of their employees. Might it be less attractive? I suppose if we think back to the previous slides where we set out how many schools had joined APTIS, we're starting to see that increase. So is it going to be a recruitment and retention issue as much as we thought it was going to be, given the volumes of schools that are now participating in alternative schemes? It could possibly be transferable. We must look at geography as to whether or not the schools within your local area are participating still in the TPS or not, and whether or not that's still going to be a potential detraction for your prospective employees. The add-on benefits, though, are something that we're seeing more and more of, be that death in service, sickness absence. So more and more benefits are being looked at. How might you cost that? Are you going to look at that coming out of the contribution that you're proposing to put in? Will you add it on or not? So there seems to be a lot more flexibility with the DC schemes than with the TPS scheme. But as I say, speak with the financial advisors who will give you the ins and outs of that. The next slide then looks at what other approaches you might take. Phased withdrawal. We were all waiting on phased withdrawal over the summer, and with effect from the 1st of August now. That's possible. So if you are a TPS school, phased withdrawal enables you to ring fence TPS to those who are current employees. So any new joiners, you can then legally pop them into a DC scheme. Whereas prior to the implementation of phased withdrawal, it wasn't possible. It was an either all in or all out scheme. Now, phased withdrawal was something that was requested during the consultation process as being a possible benefit to independent schools, hence why government concluded that yes, it would implement phased withdrawal. Is that going to have an immediate impact, however? I doubt it. So if you are going to ring fence it to current members of staff only, I suppose it depends upon the turnover of staff at your school as to whether or not you are going to make that cost saving immediately or not. Over time, perhaps you will. The other way of looking at it, however, is that perhaps over time, if you have kept it open to current staff, is it going to detract them from moving elsewhere, particularly if schools around you that they might ordinarily move on to are not offering TPS as an alternative? So you might end up finding that these staff want to stay with you because you are providing that gold-plated standard. So I think it too has its benefits as well, but don't forget the possibility of might it attract staff from moving on who might otherwise do so on a regular basis. You can operate both schemes. So do you want to just offer choice? So be that TPS and DC scheme. So TPS, you could continue as you currently are without any changes, but run alongside it a DC scheme. Now, depending upon perhaps the age profile of your staff, some might find that a DC scheme is better for them than the TPS if they've got a greater flexibility with the contributions that they too put in, whether or not some of the contributions that the employer puts in can be taken by way of salary through salary sacrifice schemes. So I think there are benefits there in still perhaps having a conversation with your staff if you do not want to move away from TPS as to whether or not they feel a DC scheme might be beneficial to them. Having said that, we had to look at whether or not it's beneficial to the school and whether or not the school wants to incur the additional costs, because then you're effectively running two schemes, if not three, one for your support staff as well. So, but weighing up the pros and cons, it is possible that you can operate those schemes in tandem. The point to bear in mind, I suppose, is in respect of auto-enrolment, the last point that we've got down on the slide, in that you must, as TPS is your auto-enrolment scheme, you must re-enroll staff back into the TPS every 3 years. Now that often causes confusion, because if you've got colleagues who are in a DC scheme and therefore contributing to a pension scheme, which it too might qualify for auto-enrolment purposes, but yet TPS is your auto-enrolment scheme, why then do you have to transfer people in and out? Now I'd say practically have a chat with your TPS representatives, because we have seen that whilst that's the requirement and legislation does require that, practically TPS are saying that if you can identify that colleagues are in a particular scheme, in a auto-enrolment scheme and a qualifying scheme, and therefore contributing, then you needn't have to do this for the sake of it every 3 years, but really that's just anecdotally. So I'd say still speak with your TPS office and understand whether or not that's something they're prepared to consider. So that's an option, operating two in tandem without having any changes. On the next slide, we look at another alternative, which is operating, again, both TPS and DC scheme, but under a total pay and reward model. So what does that mean? So if, as a consequence of this increase, or indeed as a consequence of just cost rises generally, you feel that actually we don't want to continue with the 23.68 level of cost for the school, we want to look at adjusting that, or perhaps capping where the costs might go on the next valuation. We've had schools look at total pay and reward model. So that could mean that you adjust somebody's salary if they're going to stay in the TPS, because they are getting a higher pension contribution. Now, under the TPS, the contribution rates are statutory contribution rates. So both the school and the employee must meet their contributions. But what the school can do to manage the overall cost is to ensure that they reduce the salary, but then you're contributing on a lower salary at the 23.68. And if teachers didn't want to do that, if they didn't want to have a reduced salary, they can move across to a DC scheme without that salary reduction, but with a reduced pension contribution. So overall, it becomes cost neutral if you do it that way. Some schools have used it as an opportunity to cost save, so that is also possible. But it does add another level, another dimension that you could possibly be considering. Some say that it's kicking the can down the road, that come 24, we are going to see a further huge hike in contribution rates. Will that happen? We saw 2 consultations over the summer months looking at the SCAPE mechanism. So that's looking at the calculation of contributions, how that's done by government actuaries, and whether or not the methodology could be changed so that we don't have this huge hike come the next valuation. And that's for all public sector schemes, not just TPS. So might there be some other control on that contribution? But if not, this could be another useful tool. And we have seen many a school use it at the moment, particularly when they're looking to put a cap on costs moving forward. So they don't want to absorb any future costs that might come the 24 valuation, and consulting with staff now on that basis. So they're the different approaches that can be used. So moving on to the next slide, I thought we would have a look at how TPS might want you to report to them in the event that you do seek to withdraw from TPS. So do expect to have to complete one of these checklists. It's actually quite a useful checklist, I'd say, because it does break down the particular steps, the actions, the considerations that you must have gone through. And that's really quite useful because it's making sure that you can answer yourself, and indeed your governing bodies can look to ensure that you've gone through each of these particular steps before you give TPS the okay to withdraw. Because what you don't want to do is end up in a situation where you're potentially giving notice to withdraw. And some schools have then said, actually, we decided that wasn't quite right for us. Can we now go back into TPS? There's nothing stopping you, but you will have to then potentially have to pay costs to do that. So you have to pay a bond to do that, and you don't want to be in that position. So let's just get it right before we get to that position. So I thought it was just a useful checklist just to share. And you can find that on the TPS website. Then before I move on and hand over to Alice, there are a couple of other aspects that I wanted to have a look at, and that was in respect to the trade unions. So what are we seeing when it comes to the trade unions? I wanted to share in particular the NEU. So the NEU had its annual conference in April, and at that conference they passed a particular motion to say that they would oppose any independent schools seeking to withdraw from the TPS. So I've set out there for you the conference motion that was passed and how they propose to support their members in the independent sector. And that's not only to support them from avoiding from a school withdrawing from TPS, but also supporting them in seeking recognition at their particular school, if that's what they want, and if the votes do carry in their favour for looking for union recognition. What does union recognition actually mean? Well, where schools, independent schools, do have trade union recognition, that means that any changes to terms and conditions in respect of holiday pay hours, that dialogue is had with the trade unions and not with staff directly. So that's what it means to have it. Now, the maintained sector are very used to having recognition agreements, less so in our sector, but we are seeing more and more of it happen now. So I just want you to be aware of it. And I think this dialogue rightly is one because the unions want to support their members. But I think more broadly, perhaps they are also worried about what might happen in the academies sector. Might academies be given the freedom, the same freedom as independent schools have, to withdraw from TPS? At the moment, they don't have that added flexibility. It is a requirement for both the maintained sector and the academy sector to offer its staff TPS. But I think that's the greater worry on the horizon for the NEU. So on the next slide, I've taken the 5-step action plan from the NEU website, just so you're familiar with what might come if you are in the process of thinking about moving into this dialogue. So direct from their website, we will support members opposing any proposal to remove teachers' membership of the TPS. And their 5-step plan to defend the TPS in the sector there starts with a meeting with the members, and it's all around dialogue and bringing the unions in to have the conversation on their behalf. And we have seen that lead to the likes of not only recognition and ballots for recognition, but also now more and more so ballots around strike action and the threat of strike action. And that has really gained traction, particularly since some consultations were undertaken during lockdown, and that's really upped the ante with the trade unions. And so they are pushing for this more and more so. So this calendar year, we've seen a great more of it, and undoubtedly you would have heard in the sector press about those schools who have had to be in that position and had to face, do they continue with the consultation, or do they now pause and take a step back? And you'll also see I've put the resource. If you follow that link through to the website, you'll also see the number of schools that they talk about where they have defended their members' position, and the number of schools that they have forced to backtrack on their position. So I think you really must be aware of what's happening there with the unions. And that thought about, do we go into this or do we not, has to be with the end game in mind, being that if you were forced into a corner of strike action, what would your response be? And I think those sorts of questions you must ask yourselves, both as senior leaders, as governors, to understand how might you respond in that situation. Because quite often our concern is if schools start this process only to not continue, but want to resume it at a later date, might they find themselves in a far more difficult position with their common room. On that note, I want to hand over to Alice, who will then pick up on the consultation, and here's the overview for you.
Thanks ever so much, Naseem. Yes, as Naseem explained, we thought we would look at some of the key stages of the process, but really, rather than the detail, I'm going to pick out some of the highlights, but also then look at what we have experienced and some perhaps lessons learned and some of the pitfalls in relation to each stage. So in terms of the key elements, I'm going to look briefly at planning, how to announce it to your staff, the election of the representatives, the collective consultation process, then the individual consultation process, and finally, if necessary, the need to give contractual notice and offer re-engagement. So looking at project planning first, you need to spend significant time getting your ducks in a row, really, before you launch into a plan. And I would say that even those schools that are just having a watching brief and communicating with staff should ensure that they know what they're doing and what messaging they want to be giving. You need to be thinking about what your proposal is now and what it might be in the future, so that the communication throughout is clear and consistent, and you're not going to backtrack or start something off that you're not then going to follow through. You need to think about who's going to be involved, and the timelines are critically, when do you want this to take effect, and work backwards. Look at that in a sec, in a bit more detail, and making sure that you've got sufficient time to deal with this. Also thinking about what the school you've got on at the moment. Obviously it's been particularly challenging couple of academic years for staff, and certainly that has made these kinds of processes even more important for schools to deal with, but actually perhaps more difficult as well on the ground. And think about who's going to prepare the documentation, when you're going to get it ready, and how it's going to be produced and shared with staff. So before you begin, there's quite a lot of work to do in getting everything up together. So what are some of the pitfalls or things that we have seen, or some of our recommendations? So moving on to that, thinking first about who should be involved, and involving the right personalities. Now that will be specific to your school in a way, and understanding how relationships work, whether the governors are well known and visible to the staff body, for example. But there are definitely some lessons that have been learned from projects over the last year or so. I think critically, we really need to make sure it's a team approach. We know that heads and senior academic members of staff will of course be affected by this decision, and that makes this more difficult, but as a minimum, you need to ensure that they understand, they support the school's decision, and they are going to demonstrate their support and agreement and acceptance of that decision all the way through. We have seen some heads take more of a lead and lead the common room through it, and that can be quite effective, but I don't think you should expect that of your head, but you certainly don't want the head to be contrary to the decision, or putting a blocker in the way, because that division can cause problems as well. It's a decision of the governing body at the end of the day, and I think we all understand and accept that. You need to make sure that you've got a panel of governors who are willing to be visible and seen and manage this through. But it is interesting, we've had comments that, you know, it's the first time that governors have been known to the Common Room or staff when they're, you know, popping up to give them this bad news, taking away the teachers' pension scheme. So think about that. And if your school isn't planning to withdraw or make any changes for now, it actually may be one of the things that's worth putting into place, you know, actually having greater visibility of governors and being involved in positive ways, so that if and when the time comes that you are going to have to action this, you won't have that criticism levied at you as well. I think if you've begun and you've got your working party of governors supported by the senior leadership, I would also say you need to make sure that all your board absolutely understand the basis for the proposal, what is being proposed, and ultimately what they may have to decide and to see it through. As Naseem has said, we've seen quite a lot of pushback now and a lot of union activity, and your full board may need to decide to proceed with the decision to withdraw in the face of threats of industrial action, for example. And so it's absolutely essential that there are no gaps between what people understand and what they want to achieve. And it's really important to make sure that you've got strong communication all the way through, from your staff to your senior leaders to across the board as well. Think about timing. So you will probably know that you need to work backwards. Your teachers will be entitled to at least one term's notice of the change. And that's certainly absolutely required if you're giving notice of termination. You may have other members of staff who are on more than a term's notice. So think about that. If they're on 2 terms or even a year's notice, how are you going to address that? Are you going to deal with it up front and get a waiver of that lengthy notice? Or actually, are you going to build it into the time frame? So then working back from that notice date, that's the note you've got to, if you issue notice and they take a term to take effect, before that, you need to build in a consultation period, both a consultation collectively and then with individuals. The legal requirement is 30 days consultation if you're going to affect 20 or more staff, and 45 days if it's 100 or more staff. Have to say, in reality, it is going to take longer than that. That's 30 calendar days or 45 calendar days. But I would say that every project we've been involved in has had a longer consultation process than that. You may get pushback that you should be using a 60-day consultation, which is the requirement under pensions legislation. Now, we're satisfied that that doesn't apply when you're coming out of the GPS, but there may be arguments that it applies in relation to the replacement scheme that's being put in place if you're going down that route. So actually, if you have got the time, it's definitely helpful to be able to say that you've built in that 60 days in any event, and it avoids any arguments from the unions that you're not meeting any legal requirements. But actually, as long as you've got the 30 or 45 days, depending on your staff numbers, you will have met the employment law requirements in this situation. You need to think about who's going to communicate and how you're going to communicate. I'm going to talk about consultation in a bit, but thinking about how you formulate that proposal and make sure that you haven't either made a decision or that it's not too open, and so discussions are effective is really important. As I say, I look at that in a little bit more detail. You may also have been aware of what we call the Section 188 letter. That's the notification that starts the formal consultation process. It is a requirement to issue that letter when you're embarking on a process, when it's contemplated or envisaged that you may be commencing proposals which could result in the termination of contracts of 20 or more members of staff. Of course, if you're going to be changing the contractual rights of your teaching staff, it is possible that you may need to issue notice, and therefore the requirement to issue that Section 188 letter, and that starts the formal consultation timeline for the purpose of those 30 and 45 days, as mentioned. What's been, I was going to say interesting to Naseem and me and other employment lawyers is that the unions have been jumping on schools who have issued this Section 188 letter at the beginning and saying, well, hold on, you're going into this already saying that you're going to terminate contracts and offer re-engagement, therefore it's a fait accompli, it's not a genuine consultation. Now that argument simply doesn't hold water. They should know, well they do know, of course, that issuing that letter is a legal requirement and it's really just to commence the process. But it has been used to stir up staff and has caused lots of consternation. And so it's led us to consider the timing of that Section 188 letter. And if you've got plenty of time, whether actually you may want to have sort of a pre-consultation to explore alternatives to withdrawal of the teacher's pension scheme, looking at other cost-saving measures, for example, and seeing whether essentially they can be discounted, and then moving to a decision that is we've got to consult on withdrawal and potential termination and re-engagement, and therefore we're now issuing the Section 188 letter a bit later on. But it's an interesting dynamic and quite a hard judgment call that, and legally, absolutely, it's essential that you issue that letter before the 30 or 45 days starts running as well. Similar arguments around the HR1 form. Again, this is a statutory requirement to let the Secretary of State know if you are going to make 20 or more members of staff bring their contracts to an end. Again, you know, we used to say issue that at the beginning so that you didn't forget and you'd complied with those requirements, and because also you are expected to tell them on the form whether you've shared that with the reps in the consultation process. But I think our view now is that actually that's probably premature, and we've had the Secretary of State respond to say it's too early, and in fact you're better off leaving that to slightly later on in the process when you know how many contracts you may have to terminate, if that becomes necessary to do. So you'll see there's quite a lot to think about in these planning stages around the timeline and how you're going to put the message across when you first begin. And so that leads us really to the announcement or the kickoff and the implementation, which are covered on the next slide. And this is after, of course, you've done all your planning that you've got ready. It's when you're first going to start talking to your teaching staff about the proposal. And it's essential to get that right. So think about who is going to make that announcement, who's going to be present. Obviously, we've had predominantly virtual announcements over the last 18 months or so, but more schools are now thinking about whether to do that in person because perhaps of the ease of communication, but it's absolutely essential you think about everybody. And so if you've got people who are concerned about attending in person, make sure that they can access it too, or those who are obviously off. Absent for one reason or another, or not in on that day. So make sure that you've planned to announce it to all your staff. Think about what information you're going to share immediately after the meeting and what information is going to be available. Naseem mentioned sort of the vacuum of information, and our view would be that you need to get the balance right between bombarding staff with too much information, but making sure that they know that they are going to get the information that they need and how they access it. So you might start off with a fairly short announcement that they can absorb. They understand that they're going to receive more information afterwards, but they understand that their first step is to elect those representatives. They understand where they can access information and how it's going to be disseminated to them as well, and how they can ask questions and what the timeline is likely to be like. So you're trying to reassure them that they don't need to panic, they don't need to absorb everything on day one, they don't need to read everything on day one, but actually it will be there and they will have an opportunity to read and absorb and have plenty of time to deal with things as they go through. So then moving on to electing reps and the critical collective consultation process. As Naseem mentioned, if you recognise a trade union, some of you will, a number of schools that we work with do have formal recognition agreements in place, then it will be those representatives who you need to consult with for the purpose of this process. In that case, you may be thinking about whether it's just those reps or whether you can broaden out the dialogue, and whether that's strategically a helpful thing to do. But for the majority of schools who don't have a recognition agreement in place, you will need to elect, teaching staff will need to elect representatives for the purpose of the consultation. And their role is not to give their own views, but actually to act as a conduit of information, to go out and share detailed information with the staff that they are representing, and bring it back to the collective consultation meetings that they need to attend, in order to share their views and representations of staff, so that you, when you're holding the meetings, really understand the perspective of staff, and that you've considered any proposals they want to put forward, any suggestions as to how it may take place. The purpose of a collective consultation is to try and reach agreement. It's got to be around the ways and means of avoiding the dismissal, so trying to reduce the number of staff where you've got to terminate their contracts, and to mitigate the consequences on staff. So thinking about all the other alternative options. But if you are going down that route, when's it going to take place? Can it be any later? What kind of alternative scheme is coming in? And making sure you're getting their views. There's a comment at the end that it places a significant burden on representatives, and it absolutely does. And certainly we have seen a reluctance of staff to step forward. I think we often get asked, will we need to ballot if we've got too many representatives? What if it's an unwieldy number? We never really see that. We actually see that staff are reluctant to step forward, and actually senior leaders can play an important role in encouraging a broad range of representatives who are trusted to come forward and help act as nominated representatives for their staff as well, and think about the timing for them, whether they need time off some of their duties, maybe not doing cover, in order that they've really got time to seek the views of their colleagues and to meet with one another and prepare for the meetings and read all the papers. So demonstrably help your reps to do their job, and support them in that as well. If we flick over, I've got a couple more slides on effective consultation and the pitfalls. So think about how you frame the consultation documents. Certainly we still see quite a lot of paperwork that refers to decisions, or is very abrupt in saying we've got to go down this route, there are no other options. You need to really carefully demonstrate that you're going into a consultation having formulated a proposal, so not with a blank sheet of paper, and with good reasons to having formulated that proposal, but in a way that it's absolutely open-minded, and that you are trying to seek agreement on the substantive points. Again, we have seen consultations where there have been lots and lots of meetings, or it's been very drawn out and protracted, but very little progress has been made. So again, we would really advocate having some clear agendas, so that everybody understands what's going to be discussed at each meeting. Now, you may need to be flexible and change that depending on how it goes, but actually so that there's a clear focus. So you're not trying to cover everything across the whole period of time, but say meeting one might be on the business case and other alternatives, and so that they know that they are coming to the meeting to seek information on that, to understand, then they can go away, share that information, ask questions on that specific point, and they come back to the next meeting, and you can see, you can document which elements are agreed and which elements are not agreed, before you then move forward to look, for example, at the potential alternative schemes, and what the terms and conditions relating to that are. And so for each meeting, you've got a clear agenda, and you can hopefully demonstrate, come to the end, understanding where you've got agreement and where you haven't, and what alternatives have been put forward and discussed, and so that you can then feed that back. Naseem mentioned trade unions, and definitely it's one of the most challenging aspects at the moment, and all schools should have really thought about how they're going to engage with their trade unions. You certainly cannot block your staff seeking advice from their trade unions. It's quite hard sometimes to get a handle on how active your staff bodies are in the trade union, in the trade unions. But if you can, if you've got any sense of how much you involve trade unions at the moment, or how many staff are members of different trade unions. That's quite helpful to know that and understand it beforehand, but may not be possible. But certainly make sure that staff are aware that they can go and seek advice from their trade unions. Ideally, you would want to keep a line of communication directly with your members of staff. So you want staff to feel that they are being listened to, that it's advantageous to them to have that direct dialogue with senior leaders, with governors who are making these decisions, but that they're not being disadvantaged by not being represented by their trade union. And so that trade unions, they can share information by their trade unions and feed information back as much as possible. You really need to get the message across that what you want to hear is the members of staff's point of view, and you want the trade unions to help the staff put their perspective forward, not that the trade unions are fighting their national agenda, as Naseem mentioned. And yeah, think about the risk of recognition. We are certainly seeing more requests for recognition than ever before, although they could do it in partway through the process and to destabilise the process. We're probably seeing that less than, certainly I've seen schools where they've had requests for recognition early on. So where schools have just started some sort of dialogue and over quite an extended period of time and staff are worried, they go to the unions, and so you might get a request for recognition before you even begin a formal process, and then you'll need to deal with that first. And obviously, if there's the support, that then means that you're engaging with the unions through the consultation process. But certainly, quite a number of others, the unions have supported staff through the consultation process, but then afterwards made an application for recognition with having had an opportunity to speak to staff and say to staff that they would benefit in the future for having them at the forefront of the consultation process as well. So just be aware that is something that may happen. I think I've probably covered most of the pitfalls, but I would just see what's on the next slide if there's anything else that I haven't mentioned in relation to consultation. Yeah, we did want to mention about information, because that is probably, again, one of the main areas where we've seen a battleground at the beginning. Think really carefully about what information you're going to share, and you will see, if you look on the NEU and the NASUWT website, that some of their standard letters and their standard sort of information at the beginning is to try and get this financial information. It's a really hard balance, because what you don't want is your staff to feel like they don't understand, that they've got to be qualified accountants in order to consult. Actually, you want to take them through so that they understand that there is a business need to make this decision, and then focus on ways in which they can perhaps make up the cost savings or look at financial sustainability going forward. But I think, in a sense, that if it looks like you're trying to hide information or not being open and transparent, again, it's something that you can't get over and acts as a constant point in the consultation. So you do need to think about how you're going to share it, and you may think creatively. So rather than providing everybody with detailed information, you present it at the collective consultation meetings with some Q&As afterwards. So you're thinking about that as well as you go through. Right, I'm just going to finish off before handing over to Naseem to sum up. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, please, Amy. I'm going to talk about individual consultation briefly, and then the litigation risk. So once you have completed your collective consultation, you will need to individually consult, but only where you can't get the agreement of people to the change. So if you're making a contractual change, you can't get agreement, you will then need to consult with individuals before deciding whether or not to bring their contract to an end as a result. So you need to make sure that you've built in some time to do that during the process. one consultation meeting may be enough, but actually make sure you build in time for a follow-up if they raise lots of points, so you can demonstrate it's genuine as well. Think about who is going to do those meetings. Again, if lots of people haven't agreed at the outset, and in fact that is what we're seeing, that people are holding on, you will need to think about who carries out those meetings and how you can get them in the diary and in accordance with your time frame. And if it's different people, so different senior leaders, for example, carrying out those meetings, how to ensure consistency, having a script, making sure it's clear, and ultimately who is making the decision to terminate contracts. That will be the governor's decision. So again, you'll need to think about how that is fed back, and whether that's a committee or it's going back to the full board, depending on the timing as well. Once you've issued notice, there's also a right of appeal. So again, slightly odd. I think it's the right thing to do to offer an appeal, because that's part of a fair and lawful process. But obviously the governors will have been involved in the decision by that time, say, to withdraw or offer a tandem scheme, whichever model you're going down. And they will have also been possibly involved in the decision generally to terminate contracts and re-engage. So the appeal in this instance is really a review, thinking about the individuals' issues that they may want to raise, but you should definitely involve governors who have not been involved, directly in the consultation process, so not the working party, for example, to show that it's as clear as possible, as fair as possible in that appeal. So just moving on to some of the things to think about in relation to that. Think about timing, think about who's holding the meetings. We've discussed, think about what you can possibly agree at those times. But obviously, if you're coming out of the TPS, it's very difficult to negotiate individual deals, and that's very difficult in the context of this sort of collective processes as well. But think about what it is that the individual wants, and whether a termination or engagement is going to be justified when you do it. And ultimately, you then reach a decision as to whether it's going to be legally justified to terminate and their contracts and offer re-engagement. So just thinking about the risks of litigation before I hand over to Naseem. When you're thinking about the risks of litigation, which is just on the next slide, you've got to think about, have we got a good business case? Have we got a discernible business reason to make this change? If so, have we undertaken it through a fair process? Have we consulted effectively? Have we given sufficient warning? Have we weighed up the alternatives? Potentially, if you're imposing a change, you may have individuals resigning and claiming constructive dismissal. That's possible, but less likely. But maybe, for example, if you're imposing pay freezes or even pay cuts without agreement. In most of these cases where you're implementing a different change of pension scheme, you are going to be issuing contractual notice and re-engagement, and so that will be a dismissal, even if they accept the new job. And so you may then have the risk of unfair dismissal claims. You should be able to effectively defend those if you've got that good reason, you follow through the fair process. You need to be aware of the potential risk and the quantification of that risk if you've got many members of staff where you're at that point in time as well. We are also seeing a few claims for discrimination, which are interesting, very speculative claims, say around age discrimination, and we will see how those turn out. Right, I'm conscious I've covered a lot of ground, but I'm going to hand over to Naseem to summarise, and then we can get to your questions.
Thanks, Alice. So that is a lot of information, but just to recap, preparation. I think preparation. It can't be underestimated, really. We tend to take a good half term at least, at the very least, to make sure when we're supporting our schools that we are really prepared with all the documentation we'll need, with the decision making that the governors have gone through, and just to really be there and supporting, just to make sure that all the types of questions that we know are likely to be thrown up, not that we want to preempt absolutely everything, but to be as prepared as possible before you start in this. So we are going into this with eyes wide open, really. As part of your consultation, if you do decide whether that's with a capital C or a small c, I don't see any harm with those staff education sessions. If staff, by now perhaps, it was always a dialogue that teachers don't really understand TPS. Whether or not we've moved on from that dialogue, but I'm sure you'll understand how it's viewed at your school. So will that education piece be helpful for staff to understand what is TPS? If you are thinking about moving to a DC, what is a DC? What's the differences? But don't sugarcoat it. Do be absolutely clear with your staff what the benefits are for TPS. Because we've seen a lot of pushback that you're just trying to bring in financial consultants who will just try to sell DC to us. It's more about an information piece, really. And that clarity around the communication, the proposal, and what it all means, and the way in which those meetings, etc., are all held. Again, we need to make sure, as Alice has said throughout, communication is going to be key. Who is communicating is going to be key. What that proposal means. And my one piece of advice, we don't just focus on what the next valuation might bring. Look at the school's cost base now. Is it a cost that you're prepared to continue to absorb? Is it cost control? Do you feel that actually you're losing that cost control? Do you want to make sure you've got some retention on that? Because that to me is a key part of this conversation, really. And that whole timing, not being rushed, making sure your staff have more than adequate time in being able to put forward their points for discussion and consultation. So they are all key points just to recap on. Now, before we move on to the Q&A, there are two quick polls, please. So the next slide will just show you the questions that we're asking of you, just for you to choose between where might you be on this. Now, this is all anonymous, so do feel free to put forward your response. So schools shan't be identified, and the information that we receive from these two polls we'll make sure shared with you when the slides and material are shared after this session. So we'll just wait for those votes to come in. Right, so remain TPS, a small number, far smaller than I thought, but then we have to look at the number of people who have responded to that point. Exit TPS and introduce a DC, perhaps where we expect it to be. Interesting to note the final one, introducing the total pay and benefit. Again, we are seeing a lot of schools move in that direction. Perhaps it is to tie them over into the next valuation and then to measure expectation going forward, but we are seeing more of that. And then finally, the last poll, please. It's more around when might you plan upon the changes? We should be getting that information coming through shortly. So this year, 49% there. From September 23, 29%. No plan changes as well, sorry, I missed that. And from the next valuation implementation of 18%. That's really interesting. Thank you so much for completing those polls, and we'll be sure to share that information with you. And before we do wrap up, I'd just like to turn to the Q&A. Alice and I will take these between us. So let's just scroll up. Do you know the number of teachers in the schools who have left? Teachers in the schools who have left. Alice, have you got a response on that one?
No, I mean, I don't think anyone has done that calculation. I mean, potentially you could if you were minded, because we have you can actually find in the information request the list of all the schools, and actually on the Charity Commission, they've got numbers of staff, whether they probably haven't got the numbers of teaching staff. So I think it's hard to get a sense of the scale of size of the school, but I think you would struggle to find the exact numbers of teachers within each school. who have left. But if you wanted to get a sense of the size of the school, you could do that. And I think certainly we saw it at the beginning, probably fair to say that they were the smaller schools and some of the commercially owned schools initially, but now schools of all size are coming out or making a change from one way or another. Do you agree with that, Naseem?
I do. And that last FOI in July of this year, it's got the full list there of the 200 plus schools. But yes, it does need a number crunch, and it's not something that I'm aware that has been done. Any evidence that recruitment is in a non-TPS environment is problematic? Anecdotally, I've only heard from a couple of schools who have said they've had applicants ask the question and then decline to proceed. But in the number of schools that we advise to, that's just minutiae. I've heard differently.
No, I mean, I think it's one of those points that comes up because people have concerns about it, but we still haven't got any information. So no, I think everybody is watching that. And for those schools who are coming out and perhaps using it to put a more flexible benefit package in place and more money into the pay scale, which a number of the schools we're working with are doing that. They're hoping to compete in other ways. And of course, you have so many other reasons why staff want to work at your schools, the quality of the working environment and everything about the professional development and support they get whilst working there that you need to focus on, I think.
So the next question, when operating both TPS and the DC scheme, can staff who exit TPS opt back in later on, or is that option closed out legally? So that all comes down to whether or not you're operating phase withdrawal. So if you're operating TPS and DC scheme in tandem with that phase withdrawal, there's still flexibility for colleagues to move between the schemes. If you operate both, but then with phased withdrawal as well, then you are ring-fencing TPS to those existing staff. So if somebody had opted out, gone into a TPS, into the DC scheme, sorry, then they shan't be entitled to go back in. So that if you are planning on doing that, you really do need to make sure that's part of the consultation, because quite often the flexibility of moving between the schemes is seen as a plus when operating the hybrid scheme. Is there a need for further consultation when TPS contribution rates go up in future under the pay and reward model? This one's asked time and again, isn't it, Alice? So now, which one?
I'll go. Yeah, I mean, the answer in simple terms is yes, in that you will need to consult in some way or other. Now, employment case law is really clear that it's very, very difficult to essentially get individuals to agree a variation of their pay without knowing what that may be. So you will need to at least consult with them if you're planning to reduce pay again when TPS contributions go up. Having said that, I think thinking about what your new contractual terms are, if you are going down the total pay and reward model, is really important, and trying to be as clear as you can about the potential for the future. And certainly we would want to try and make sure that you wouldn't need to go through a formal collective consultation process requiring termination and re-engagement if you'd adopted that model. So it's, as Naseem said, it's quite a difficult question, and it requires careful drafting and real clarity in the first consultation process with the members of staff and clear contractual wording in place. But then what you can't really do is completely say, well, we can pass on any increase in contributions to our members of staff without doing anything further. That would be difficult, but you can manage it as best you can to minimise the need to bring contracts to an end and re-engage, both for new staff who are joining in the gap and your existing members of staff as well.
And just to add to that, I think the way in which you can manage that is also around the comms. Because if we're planning on making changes now with a view to a change happening in 2024, you want to make sure that annually you have it on the agenda, that you're speaking to your staff about it, that you, in your annual pay review letters, that you do say, and remember, this is the agreement that was made, and this is how your pay can be varied, etc. So that when it comes to 24, we're hopefully not having to go through a full collective consultation. It will be a case of we have reminded you year upon year. This is the basis upon which we have entered into this agreement. And you'd hope then that conversation will be far smoother. But I think it really comes down to also the amount of reduction in pay they have to take in time. So moving on to the next.
I'll pick up the next one and then you do the next couple. Yeah, so it's the question here, we've been offering both TPS and ACTIS for some time, and the ACTIS take-up is low. Could we issue section 188 at the start of the consultation, as we've tried ways of reducing costs, but with no success? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good example, and we've got lots of schools who are in that position, who offered schemes in tandem at the beginning and now need to take some more robust action probably. And I think it would be absolutely reasonable to say we've explored all other alternatives, but now we do need to essentially propose on withdrawal from the TPS and moving everybody over to the alternative scheme we've got in place, which is ACTIS. And so therefore we are going to formally consult and we'll issue the section 188 letter. So I agree. I think in those scenarios, you're in a strong position to say we've already been through the process and therefore we're now into the sort of second phase, really.
So moving on, in your experience, how many non-unionised schools have subsequently become unionised as a result of this consultation? So by unionised, I'm taking that to mean how many have now gone down the path of a voluntary recognition agreement. Now, I know of a couple. When you look on the NEU in particular, look on their website, they say that they have 100 schools with recognition agreements in the independent sector. But that number hasn't changed from pre-19. So perhaps this isn't as a consequence of this particular consultation. Maybe some have been added to that. But that number, as I say, has been on their website for quite some time. So I wouldn't be too frightened of that. And am I worried about recognition more generally? I think schools shouldn't be so worried because you are consulting on a finite number of changes, so hours, holiday, and pay. Now that's only when you're making collective changes. So it doesn't prevent you or preclude you from having one-to-one conversations where you are making the odd change in pay, for example. So it's easy for me to say because I'm not the school in that situation, but perhaps I'm less worried for our schools if they do have a recognition agreement. Next one, where a VRA is in place with the unions and an agreement on exiting the TPS is reached, is there any scope for individual staff members to appeal if they are unhappy, or must they accept the collective bargaining outcome? Now, collective bargaining is there to reach an agreement on behalf of those that they are representing. So once you have gone through that collective bargaining, if you have reached an agreement, well done you, because there's not many unions that are reaching agreement. But let's just say agreement was reached, you can then tell staff that this is what's now going to take effect moving forward. But they can still say that they're not content. And I would cover all bases and make sure that I'm still going through any appeals with those individuals. Alice, I don't know if you would take a different stance, but I think to be absolutely safe, I would do that.
I absolutely agree. And I think really it comes down to the fact that it's really unusual to have collectively incorporated terms in the independent sector, even when you've got voluntary recognition, and certainly for something so significant. So I have to say, well, I think reaching agreement is maybe a challenge to start with, but even so, I think it's still then appropriate. Your comms with staff will slightly differ in that you'll be saying it has been agreed, but if people still object, I would definitely still have an individual consultation and an appeal process with them. The next one made me smile because that's what's happened in so many cases. What happens if staff refuse to engage in consultation thinking it will delay everything or will go away? We've absolutely seen that. I mean, in probably the vast majority of projects, it's really hard, and you need to tell people that it's important that they engage. And so that's why the communication with saying to them, right, this is the first meeting, this is what we need your views on, and then this is, we're documenting that, and then this is the second meeting, we need your views on that. And actually no one's raised any questions, we're documenting that to try and make sure that you proactively encourage that engagement and that they understand that a decision will be made. Because certainly I can think of a number where they've either just trusted the trade unions who say leave it to us, or the reps who say leave it to us, or they're just not engaged. And that causes problems, and then you suddenly have a flurry of activity right at the very end, when almost you're at a point of saying, right, we've reached the decision, is the first time they start engagement, and that's not helpful to anybody. So you really need to try and manage your meetings to avoid that where possible. And I would say that, as well as communicating with your reps, think about how you communicate with the whole of your staff body and bring them along. So I would definitely share information broadly all the way through, even when you've got a recognition agreement, so that staff are forced to engage really, and they really know it affects them, and that they don't just suddenly think, oh, I'm not a rep, I don't need to worry about this, till too late in the day.
I've got nothing to add to that. I think that's absolutely fair. Yes, a recording will be made available, and we'll share the link with you, as Amy mentioned at the off, in due course. Advantages, disadvantages of recognition, and can it be forced on schools? Let's start with the latter. Can it be forced on schools? It really comes down to the will of the common room. So if the common room is balloted for recognition, and the ballot carries in favour of recognition, school could still say no at that point. But actually, if the union then moved for statutory recognition, the likelihood is that they will get it. So I always worry about the relationship with the common room, and if that's what they want, I wouldn't be frightened of putting it in place, because I'd be far more frightened of not carrying the common room with me if I pushed against it. Alice, I don't know if you have a different view to that.
No, I agree with that. I think, ideally you want to persuade your common room that it's better that they have a direct dialogue with you. But if you get the sense that the vast majority want recognition, then it's far, far better to accept that and shape that and get a voluntary agreement in place, and try and work from a cooperative stance. Because if you fought it every step of the way and then recognition is foisted upon you, it's a really difficult relationship already at the beginning, and that's only going to make matters worse. So I absolutely agree. And Naseem, I would echo the thoughts that you had really. I completely understand why, as an independent school, you want freedom of decision making, and the idea of trade unions being involved in pay negotiations, for example, is one you would want to avoid. But I certainly work with a number of schools who have had recognition agreements in place, independent schools, for a long period of time, and actually it isn't a disaster by any stretch. And in fact, generally, although pensions have been difficult across the board, other things are managed quite constructively, and they can play a really helpful role in the dialogue. So yeah, it's not too problematic. It's not too problematic, and particularly if you spend some time building good relations with your staff reps and your regional reps.
I agree, and that perhaps picks up on some of the advantages and disadvantages also, because I do think that direct communication with common room, if you can have that, is absolutely fundamental, I'd say. But equally, the trade unions could be used to make sure that that communication echoes what you want in the school as well. So I wouldn't be shying away from it just because it is engagement with the trade unions. And that brings us to our last question. Thank you so much all. And we really do look forward to meeting you in person at some point very soon. But thank you from Alice and myself, and I'm going to hand back to Amy.